Are the wheels falling off? A number of government announcements in the last week or so gave the impression the wheels are starting to come off at the beehive. It's not just the COVID decisions are increasingly erratic, though they are. Ministers have almost lost the room, particularly in Auckland, and seem to have no ability to do things that will win it back. It started last Friday with the confusing and indecisive traffic lights announced, cynically held until the eve of the long weekend. It raised more questions than it answered.
So, when all three of Auckland's DHBs are 90% double dosed, the city will move to a new traffic light system and ready, set, stop.
Aucklanders and Waikato people really need to know is, when do we come out of lockdown? There wasn't even a target date. The government had been dragged, kicking and screaming for weeks to announce a vaccine date. When they finally did, they set an almost impossible one in a vain attempt to recover the world-leading tag so important to the Prime Minister. Aucklanders don't want to be world-leading anymore. They just want to be able to go to the shops, meet with their mates without feeling they might be breaking the law. In other jurisdictions, leaders announced target dates and scales of freedom that increase at waypoints like 70, 80 and 90% double vaxxed, but not here. We stay hair-shirt and locked down because that's what Wellington thinks is good for us. Wellington, of course, being the one place that isn't locked down. According to current vaccination projections, Auckland won't hit 90% target until the end of November, by which point we'll have spent more than 100 days in a lockdown doing huge damage to the city and its people. The Prime Minister does herself no favours by refusing to address the timeline, or even less in telling people cheerfully that the city is nearly at 90% single-vaxxed, as if that means anything for people's freedoms. Taking the voters for fools is not a sustainable strategy. It's made worse when the reason for the lockdown, a slow vaccination rollout, no urgent hospital upgrades, delayed vaccination certificates, no rapid antigen testing, are obvious to nearly everyone. Things haven't got any better for the government since the end of the week of big announcements. People are now more confused and directionless than at the beginning. That takes up special political skill. The nadir was Chris Hipkins' non-announcement of any changes in the education settings on Wednesday. After claiming the MIQ announcement and then delaying it, and then introduced precisely nothing. There was a vague reference to primary schools possibly opening in Auckland in the middle of November, but that was it. Education is one of the areas where political contradictions are most obvious. Why is it that years 8 and 9 students aren't allowed back in when they're as vaccinated as years 11 and 13? Why does the vaccination mandate not apply to teachers until January, when it applies to other mandated employees earlier? Who knows? Contradictions are bound everywhere. The MIQ announcement was still half-measure, and it pleased no one. It's apparently okay for people living here who have COVID to isolate at home, some 280 at the last count, while double vaccinated Kiwis with no COVID who've had a myriad of tests still have to spend 7 days in MIQ prison arriving back into New Zealand. Retaining the MIQ bottleneck is nonsensical, inflexible, but more so inhumane. The internal border is another hive of contradictions. Auckland and Waikato are locked off from each other, yet both are locked down. The police set up roadblocks to stop Aucklanders leaving, but not in the Waikato and Northland, and now Christchurch, despite having community cases. The internal borders are rapidly becoming unsubstantiated. Everyone knows they won't be here by Christmas, so why not sooner? All they're likely to do is to reduce the urgencies for regional New Zealand to get vaccinated. Meanwhile, individuals and families carry on with the pain. This week we heard about a heartless decision to prevent a grieving father's sister from flying from Blenheim to Auckland to comfort him at a funeral of his 8-year-old son. He went to the media in desperation, and the decision was finally turned around, but it was too late. Asked what he would do on the day of the funeral, he simply said he would cry. We also heard of the son stuck in an MIQ as his father lay dying in Tauranga. After pleading, he was finally driven to Tauranga by MIQ staff for 2 hours and then dragged back to Auckland in time to make his scheduled release the very next day. This is becoming one of the most least compassionate governments we have seen. In non-covert news, the Minister of Local Government, having failed to persuade people of the merits of her plan to recognise the three waters, announced that she would be unilaterally confiscating the water assets off ratepayers set up and down the country, despite the opposition of nearly every council. Any sensible political inept government would have crafted a reasonable compromise, but not this one. To top the week, the Transport Minister announces the latest plan to spend a whopping $15 billion on light rail to small Labour voting slice of Auckland's isthmus. Announcing you'll spend the equivalent of 6% of our country's whole economic output in one transport project in the midst of a pandemic, which is already blowing the debt towards 50% of GDP, is completely tone deaf. It begs belief that Grant Robinson let this one out the door. The underlining thread of this week's fanatic activity is random decision-making and the non-strategic leadership. Every announcement seems to add to the pile of problems and questions rather than to shrink it. That's bad news for any government. Ministers need to straighten up the ship and start focusing on what's important to the public now, before it's too late. People in Auckland, Waikato and across the country need a clear path out of this, but government does too. When the wheels start to come off, the people in the beehive are often the last to realise it. This article was drafted by Stephen Joyce, a former National Party MP and Minister of Finance.